Hello everyone, welcome to Inform Friday. I'm Leila Angelaga and I work for Historic Environment Scotland in the technical research team. This is the last session for the spring-summer series for those of you who have been following us, and it will be an open surgery type session where we will be addressing your questions that we have asked you to email us prior to the event. So we will be mostly focusing on damp issues and energy efficiency in traditional buildings, as these have been the two most popular sessions we've had so far. So we thought it was worthwhile to do an extra session on these. As mentioned before, these sessions, we also try to point you to the wealth of resources we have online. The publications are all available on our website, and a link to the publication section will be posted in the chat. So far, we have talked about the key elements of traditional buildings, their construction methods and materials, repair methods. We have also spoken about how they work, how moisture and vapor moves throughout them, making ventilation and the choice of materials in repair very important. We have also seen how you can sensitively upgrade them to improve their energy performance and also the use of renewables. We have also spoken about common issues such as damp and how to adapt your building to cope with the changing climate. These are all on YouTube, so you can watch them all there. Today, we'll be mostly addressing questions that have come through email accompanied by photos, as we wanted you to have a clear idea of the issues that our viewers are dealing with. However, if you would like to ask us a question during the session, we'll try our best to answer it and find visually similar examples. If not, we'll ask you to email us at technicalresearch@hes.scot. And the event, as always, will be recorded and available to watch afterwards at your own leisure. So, very shortly, I'm going to welcome Roger.
Hi, guys.
As mentioned before, we are focusing on damp and energy efficiency today. It's not exclusive, but we did have a lot of questions on these topics. So we will look at these questions first, and then we will answer any other ones after we cover these. So, Roger, I'm gonna start with some questions we received via email. So, question number 1. I have an 1852 Georgian home with 2 internal walls that have moisture stains that we will see briefly on the screen. So you might be able to see the images. You might notice the darker area that they're referring to. Basically, they had a lot of people coming and looking over, and they don't think it's a leaking pipe, so they're wondering what it is.
I think this could be a modern material versus traditional material question. And I suspect some remedial work has been done in the past, and that line you're seeing is the boundary between the original lime plaster at the top and possibly a gypsum plaster lower down. The interesting thing about modern gypsum plasters is they're great for dry, well-heated houses, but if you have an older building and maybe your heating is not running all the time, particularly in the summer, they're slightly hygroscopic. They'll slightly absorb moisture. We saw this in one of our refurbishment projects quite recently, particularly in the summer when the heating was off, and we had a little bit of what you might call water absorption, which showed a little bit like this. So this may be a type of, not quite condensation, but the plaster, the modern gypsum plaster absorbing certain amounts of water from the air. The conditions on the other side of the wall are worth looking at, and I think the correspondent has mentioned that it's fairly dry and sheltered, but that might not necessarily mean all is well, because you could have a concrete perimeter around the house outside. It could be quite wet underneath. So there could be other factors going on. There is a limit to what we can tell you from photographs, but the fact that it comes and goes, that the correspondent has said it comes and goes, kind of makes me feel that this is a sort of hygroscopic sort of heating lag, high humidity in the summer type question. I think that's probably as far as we can go with that one, and might be one we take forward. But different materials, particularly gypsum plasters, deal with humidity and moisture differently, as we discovered at Holyrood Park Lodge when we did some patching with some gypsum plaster adjacent to some lime, and the effect was a little bit similar to this.
That's great, thank you. So next question is a bit more general. They're asking whether they should be ventilating under replacement solid floors to lower the vapor pressure and to limit rising damp. Now, we might need to ask for some clarification on this, but Roger, I think, can talk a little bit about generally what we mean about floors and when you need to ventilate and all that.
Yeah, so if it's a suspended timber floor, so normal floorboards on joists, and you insulate underneath that, as we've done at Holyrood Park Lodge with a wood fibre board or some other material, you do need to keep that void underneath, the solum void as it's sometimes called, ventilated with grills under the wall, on the edge of the walls, that you probably know about. This floor looks a little bit different because that's clearly a solid wall where you've got some form of rising damp blistering a little bit. Looks like an oily paint there, so there's no vapor moving quietly through there all the time. This is actually blistering through the oily paint, and that looks like possibly a parquet type floor, or a floor with quite a bit of repair. And if that is the case, we should be ventilating under that space, through the grills, under the walls, sort of outside by the flower bed type thing. But I might look at that paint as well. That doesn't look a very vapor shifting type of paint, as that's why it's blistering a touch.
And there is a question of what is underneath actually the floor that we see that we're not aware of.
Yeah, and that might be, I mean, I think it must be a suspended timber floor, otherwise how could we be asking about ventilating underneath it? But the treatment of the wall applies regardless of whatever floor you have, whether it's on the hard, on a later concrete, or if it's still on a suspended timber, because that blistering shows that there is vapor trying to escape. Scrape that oil off, put some lime wash distemper or clay paint on, and it'll keep that much drier.
And in relation to that question, we actually have received a lot of inquiries regarding damp-proof layers, and a lot of people are asking whether they can prevent problems by adding more damp-proofing. So would you like to address that?
Yeah, so damp-proofing generally, it's a sort of topic that people have different views on. Our position here is that if you get the building working right with the materials, the ground levels, the ventilation, all that sort of jazz, you don't necessarily need a damp-proof course. How effective things are if you choose not to address the causes is a matter for you, and I'm not going to get drawn into that. Certainly our damp informed guide gives you the basic framework that you need in terms of the things to look at and get right, and hopefully we can reinforce some of those messages as we go through today.
Great. Another question is also about damp in older properties. Their croft was built in 1800s and it's on the small island of Lota. It is made of stone and has had hard finish. Damp has gone in between the stones. I'm assuming they mean stone and the render. Please, can you advise the best and most economic course of action?
I see the word economic here. So I can see a couple of things going on in this image straight away. They've got gravel on possibly a geotextile layer, or maybe worse, plastic, which is not a great thing. And that it looks like quite a hard cement finish, which generally has quite a lot of small cracks in it that you don't see, that act very effectively as capillary draws, taking water in. I can't see the wall head detailing the gable, the bits higher up, so can't really speak for the whole elevation. But probably what's happening here is water's been drawn in through cracks in the cement, and then it doesn't really go anywhere. It can't get out. So the wall is becoming a bit damp. When it says hard finish, that's really the style of the finish. What is that material? And it looks to me like an OPC, ordinary Portland cement mix, probably quite hard. In terms of economic solutions, like all these things, there's options you can try. You could minimize the capillary draw through the cement by another layer of masonry paint, probably a modern masonry paint, but that might not be enough. That might bridge cracks to some degree, but if they're big, it won't. Ground levels look reasonable because I think somebody has reduced that ground level recently. Look at what you've got on the inside of the building. What's the nature of the wallpaper, the wall covering? Is that is there a plastic sheet behind your plasterboard, or is the vapor able to shift? Having cement on your walls is not necessarily a problem, but if water is getting through that cement layer, you need to somehow get it dispersed on the other side. Alternatively, if you're feeling quite strong, you could remove that and replace it with a more appropriate material, but something in your message suggests that you're not probably in that space. Maybe look at the ground conditions as well, to make sure that area underneath the gravel is not too wet and that you don't have leaks or drainage issues. And if that is a layer of plastic sticking up that I can just see curling around the gravel, probably solid plastic's not a good idea. Geotextile, maybe okay-ish. That's probably all I can say from that image. A sort of whole house picture would be, showing the whole elevation would be kind of helpful.
Great. Next question. It also came with a lot of images, so we obviously have made a selection of images because we can't show everything. They are about to insulate underfloor of a bathroom which has no external wall. It's a 1928 building, a minor type bungalow. The old external wall has a new architect design extension. The ground is red brick ash, and they've actually dug out a layer of rubble and some builder rubbish. The ground now looks a little damper. So we have a couple of photos here that we probably need to show as we're talking. They're wondering, first of all, there's a couple of questions here. One that we can't really show to people, they're asking about whether they have dug out too much, because the more they dig out, it's damper, really.
Yeah. Firstly, apologies to the viewer. I've got a sort of white eye reflection, which makes me look like some sort of swivel-eyed lunatic, but I'm not normally like this. No, back to the question then. Reducing build-up in the solum is a really good thing to do. And the fact that you've taken away the sort of top layer and you've got to sort of what might be called a sort of hot soil is probably a good place to stop. Don't go down forever. No requirement to put anything up on top of it. In fact, the finer the surface, the better it is at losing vapor. It's just better. So no reason to put gravel there. The inquirer mentioned about insulated between the joists above, which is a fairly standard process. But as we mentioned before, if you are doing that, some sort of vapor move or air movement underneath the insulated floor, and now you're looking down on a little dwarf wall there, is probably a good idea. So those openings under the brick there, you can see the 3 little openings there just above the caption. They're probably deliberate to encourage cross ventilation between the floor setup and some form of opening to get that air outside, i.e. going to an outside wall in the garden, is probably a good idea. There were mention of tubes and pipes and things. That's probably a modern accessory. We'd just settle with a metal grill to the outside to keep small furry things out and allow the air to move, and that's probably sufficient. Just by way of detail, you can tell that this is a later type of construction by the materials, by the nature of the timbers, and interestingly, you can see the creosote they put on the joist ends and the joint there, which is quite characteristic of work of that period. I also noticed a piece of particle board, which might be temporary flooring or might be going back down again.
Also, that goes with the question about the telescopic vent and where it should go.
Yeah, I don't quite know what that means, so I'm afraid I can't answer that. I'd just be going for a standard grill outside, as I indicated.
Yeah, and if you want to avoid hitting a joist, I think we can't advise because we don't know the building, we're not there, so we can't advise to that extent. Sorry, I'm just looking through. Yeah, that's all. So next question also had quite a few layers to it. They're renovating a late 1700s manor house. The construction is rubble walls with large, I'm guessing large windows, maybe, plaster internally. The hall and staircase, they were originally painted to look like stonework. You might be able to see on the next photo, there's like a painted keystone over an arch. The stairs are stone. The walls had been wallpapered and painted over the fake stonework, which the builders removed. And they think the original surface on the walls was distemper. So there's quite a few questions there. They want to clean the stonework. They're asking whether they need to plaster the walls or wallpaper. What's the best way to clean the stonework?
Right. Okay. So this is about presentation and redecoration as much as, so they don't have any tech issues. Manor House suggests England. Late 1700, I suppose, means late 1700. What does that mean? 1780, maybe? I don't know. Certainly, the decoration of hallways with a painted ashlar finish was quite common all over the UK, as a way of sort of suggesting a certain sort of style. I don't think you need to replaster these walls. There is a sort of modern fashion for sort of putting modern gypsum on top of anything old to give a smooth surface. I think probably lining paper and clay paint would be perfectly sufficient here. Some distempers would probably go back on top of this surface as it is and save yourself some money. The stonework question, I think internally we need to get away from the fact that everyone had exposed stone. The evidence says they didn't. In fact, you're looking at it because it's indeed painted with generally with a lime wash. One part of the question was, how do you treat the underside of the stairs? And that looks very much like it's been parged with some form of lime plaster and then a lime wash or distemper on top of that. So I'll just mix up some lime wash, maybe tint it a tiny bit yellow as it's got there, and just do it again. You see that quite a lot in Scotland. So just avoid the desire to sort of remove plaster work from stone, because that's like destroying the building. And you're getting a slightly closer up view of the vertical sides of what was possibly distempered. Maybe you're seeing some relic glue there that's gone a bit yellow and has sort of only partly come off. The quick answer to that, depending on the sort of smoothness of the finish you want, would be lining paper. But you could smooth that off and lime wash it, which would give you a very kind of, very pleasant surface. Clay paint is also very good at these sort of surfaces. You'll never get it totally flat and smooth, but nor would you want to, because if you did, you'd buy a modern house.
Okay. Next question is, they have a house with rubble walls and they want to stop the water getting in. They've heard of masonry waterproofers. What is our view? So
just to give the audience a feel for some of these now, what we've done is we've had a lot of questions over the last few months on various themes on masonry and waterproofing and things like that. So we've kind of batched it together to give a sort of indicative example where we can just perhaps wrap a few things up in one place. So shall we put the image up and we can touch on what we mean? So here we are, pretty standard Scottish gable end. I think I can see some sea there, maybe. This is really the sort of classic, potentially wet gable situation. We're not a fan of waterproofers because we know that the performance is partial. If you've got big holes in your wall, a waterproof won't address that. And in fact, there's a very standard way of finishing masonry walls in Scotland. It's called a Scottish harl, which is generally lime and white or off-white, and with the right finish and lime wash on top of that, which is very cheap, by the way, make it yourself, works very effectively. This wall, which is on the left of that, you can see has had the render removed and has been pointed up. I'd say that's quite a high risk situation, and I'm not convinced a waterproofer would be the answer. I might be looking at those joints quite carefully. I might flush point it, smoothish, just leaving the tops of the stones showing, and then I'd probably lime wash it. The rebuilt chimney, you can tell that's a modern a modern rebuild up there, you might just leave that as it is and keep the air moving through those flues, as that's a very good way of drying the wall. The right-hand image shows quite a decayed wall with perhaps quite a softish stone. Couldn't quite tell where that is, but something about Dundee springs to mind. That needs a bit of work before you do anything. That would need a flush point, maybe a hull, maybe not. But let's remember, a lot of traditional finish in Scotland were there for a reason. Generally, architecturally, folk didn't look at rubble masonry. That was something to be covered up and treated it as an architectural way, sometimes even with lining out. So that's kind of our view generally, that waterproofers tend to sort of shortcut some more important fabric measures. And we have a traditional waterproofer. It's called lime wash. So that's perhaps our default solution.
And just to add that with modern waterproofers, sometimes some of them are quite too strong for the stone, and they might change its color. They might actually be harmful to the stone underneath. So we generally say, as a rule, there are better ways to treat your building.
People have been doing waterproofing on walls though for a long time. There was something called isinglass that people put on, and I think there's probably been a bad habit of chucking all sorts of things on walls over the years, certainly probably since the 1920s onwards, when rubble started to become fashionable and people started to find their walls got a bit leaky. So all sorts of weird stuff's been chucked on, and we kind of steer away from that.
The next couple of images, we've actually pulled them from some of the questions we had in the past, or some of the cases that we worked on. So the next one is a mid-19th century house with cement render on the gable wall. You'll see an image in a second. And the initial question, the way it came about, it has now become a project, but the question was what to do, and they had various issues.
Yeah, so this came in from a public inquiry, a sort of technical inquiry, again, as with a lot of your messages, about cement. And cement on our buildings is not necessarily a disaster. And I've lived in a couple of old buildings with cement on, and it's just fine, as long as the detailing is right and water's thrown off the walls and doesn't run down it, and the cement isn't cracking and things like that. We put this example up very specifically because it shows you where the cracks are. It shows you how wet the masonry is behind the cracks, because that liquid water is seeping through to the front now. You can actually see it on the joints bleeding through. So in this case, that cement, we've tapped it and it's very boss, it's very hollow sounding, and it probably needs to come off. More worryingly, there's a very slight bulge on the wall, which shows you the masonry is possibly moving. We're hoping it's just the render, but it might be a bit of masonry movement too. So in this case, this will be taken off, and we'll get a look at the masonry, look at any masonry rebuilding required. Often on gable ends, where you generally get this, that the masonry is quite thin, where you have a half on the other side, and that's almost definitely what's happening here. A bit of movement. So it's not always bad, but if you've got the situation here with cracks and damp coming through, I'm afraid it's time to think quite hard about how that cement is, and equally importantly, the detailing and the building configuration above the cement. So on the skew copes, the diagonal shoulders of a building that you can just see in this image, now they are a modern agricultural coated steel, which is a bit industrial, but that's the way this building's ended up, which, as you can see from below there, is doing a reasonable job. The staining on the top, just at the very top middle of the photograph, that's because the chimney head itself is defective. And I'm going to refer you guys to Climate Change Adaptation for Traditional Buildings, Short Guide 11, that bores you to death about building detail. And I'll talk about that till the cows come home, because it's really, really important. Most of rain in Scotland comes downwards. We use wind-driven rain as kind of the world's problems. Of course it is on occasion, but most of it, statistically, by volume, it comes straight down, which is why you see staining on gable ends. So I hope that's enough. We've just had a question on Facebook, Leila. Shall we jump to that one?
Before we get to that one, I just wanted to show, because you talked about adaptation, we had another image that I think we can very quickly show that we've actually adapted a building.
Yeah. Good one.
house,
Yeah.
and just to show you what you can do to your building. Talking
Yeah.
about
So this is the gable end of a house in Shetland. It's by the sea, facing southwest. So I can say confidently it's quite exposed. This had a cement sort of finish on it, water coming in that gable end. The poor owner basically could barely live in it. We did a limited bit of support with a local architect to remove the cement, to do a flush point and a thin hull, and then lime wash pretty much everywhere. And that has gone quite well in terms of addressing the building. The rest of it has not been done yet. That's for the client to take forward, but certainly for the gable end, that worked really well. And I'll draw your attention to the chimney, the bit at the top with that quite distinctive drip detail on the chimney cope, which did need listed building consent. This is quite an old building, 1780, and it is listed, category B listed. So we did need consent for that. But because we're protecting the structure from bad, increasingly wetter weather, that was necessary for the health and future of the building. But here we've delivered a waterproofing solution with a tested traditional material that humans in Scotland have been using for 700 years or more. So it kind of works. Right, let's jump to the Facebook ones, shall we?
Yeah, we had one from Ian on Facebook. They're in Calendar, 1880s townhouse type home with high ceilings, etc. They're asking basically about floor insulation and keeping airflow via grills, and they're asking about fiberboard. They're worried about wool type products in case they attract sort of mice or mice nest there. Any suggestions for products, or is there a guide? There is actually.
There is a guide.
And it should be, we will link it in the chat. So it's called the Energy Retrofit Guide for Traditional Buildings. And then you'll be able to see all the products that we have either trialed or some we've basically assessed them, and you'll be able to compare them. I think lately, the last few years, we do prefer more sort of insulation that's more like in the wood fiber, hemp fiber side of things, because of the fact that wool is attracting moths and sort of it's good for nesting.
Yeah, it's work in progress. I think wool has they need to have the right protection to stop folk living in it. As for nests, well, animals will nest anywhere, whatever the material. To be honest, they'll chew up pretty much anything. So if you don't want mice, don't leave food lying around, and have a cat. So I don't think there's only so many things we can sort of cater for, but certainly wood fiber is fine. I'd second about the ventilation underneath as being a useful thing to do, and perhaps have a look at the retrofit guide and see if that helps.
Great. Next question from Carl on Facebook. Am I right in thinking ground level should be 150 millimeters below the bottom of the air grill? What about where you have solid floors and original flagstones? Should the exterior levels be 150 millimeters below the floors? Is there any benefit or detriment in injecting a modern damp-proof course into a late 19th century stone house?
Really good question. Yeah, so you've got an existing stone floor, and what about the ground levels? And generally, have the outside level below the inside floor level. And particularly drainage going away from the house. That's perhaps the key one here. It also slightly if the flagstones are a sandstone, they will shift a bit of vapor. If they're a harder slate, they probably won't. I don't think there's any benefit, particularly in a damp-proof course, because I don't think we'd do it. But I would be looking carefully at what are your wall coverings on the inside and the outside, so that vapor can move from the wall. Personally, I'd say that if you've got a floor like that, a hard sandstone floor, I'd be taking 150-ish as a minimum, and looking really hard at the outside drainage, where your down pipes are going. Once they go into the ground, where are they going? And if you don't know where they're going, they're probably not going anywhere. They're probably just going into the corner of your building. So maybe sort of big up on the external factors, and if you can keep the flagstones free of plasticky, acrylic varnishes, cement screeds, linoleum, or anything else that sort of might inhibit vapor movement. That'd be really good. Or if not, look at the walls, try and get the oil paint off, or make sure that they're of a kind of vapor shifting type of finish. So probably not the damp proof course in that situation. It's perhaps not something I'd go for.
Next question is partly a question, partly a comment from Johnny on Facebook. They had 2 damp patches for 7+ years as a result of the upper floor joist touching the internal wall behind the plasterboard due to bridging.
Yeah, so this looks like Johnny's on a kind of slightly sort of classic damp gable from chimneys question. And maybe have a look at our short guide on damp gables, and then the climate change adaptation guide, short guide 11, which talks about chimneys and the need to shed water. The other factor with chimneys is because of the combustion products that have built up, the sulfites and the soot and all the stuff in the chimney there, that will attract water in itself. That's a bit, it's hygroscopic. It'll hold damp itself. So you give an extra set. So movement of air in the chimney flues, keeping that wall dry by stopping it coming in from the outside. So we're back to pointing, traditional finishes, and the drip detailing as well.
Great. Next question is actually about windows from Gordon on Facebook. They were asking about maintaining sash and case windows. Is it bad practice to paint over linseed mastic ceiling between window frame and surrounding wall? I would not be prepared to use linseed paint. It would be a water-based paint.
Right. Yeah, we get asked this every now and then. I think views vary. Generally, I wouldn't. You see sometimes it sort of curls back. There's just no need to, really. Not prepared to use linseed paint. Well, it's quite a natural product. Water-based paints are acrylic, so there's plenty of chemical and oil feedstock going on in those paints. So they're not entirely consequence-free. But that's a matter for you. No, we get asked quite a lot about the mastic, and no need to paint it.
Great. Until we get any more questions through the chat and the audience, there's some other examples we can show talking about windows. We often get the question about the EPC rating. That's the Energy Performance Certificate that most of you will be aware that the guidance is changing. So they are asking about whether they can change the windows, especially with older buildings, whether that's contribute to the EPC rating, and what they can do to improve the energy efficiency of the house by changing the windows.
So quick one on windows then. Yes. So just to give you a bit of context, I think we have a window picture previously prepared by the skilled team. So here is, by the way, note the original historic colour. White windows in Scotland is a thing that came in from the 1930s onwards. If you look under the layers of paint, invariably in Scotland and England too, they were generally darker, quite often browns or often greens, and occasionally sort of red, sort of almost purple sometimes. So we've got a series of hierarchy of options with windows. It shouldn't be overly contentious. A lot depends on the nature of the glass you have, but maybe that's special and wobbly and you like it. But this would start with draft stripping and just getting the air gaps between those windows sorted out with brushes and things. Probably changing the glass in the window. There are some quite good technologies now for very efficient vacuum panes, which weigh the same, don't need any more deepening of the check, and can be puttied back in the normal way. So there's that option. Maybe they're past repair. Maybe you've had a fire. Maybe you're replacing some other window that's failed, and then you can go for a sort of modern version of a sash and case, double glazed with trickle vents and all the things you like. So there's plenty of options there, including upgrading your shutters or getting those working, which will without question keep you warmer and certainly more secure. At the moment, to my knowledge, the EPC, I don't think it recognizes shutters. It does recognize and acknowledge secondary glazing, so that's definitely possible. So yeah, just a quick diversion into windows and energy efficiency. Again, the retrofit guide does cover that in some detail, giving you perhaps a series of options that you might want to look at. And if you're listed, of course, that'll depend on your local planning authority, and perhaps a dialogue with them might be a good idea.
Great. We had a question from Al on Facebook. There's damp coming through joints of cellar flagstones in center of lower ground floor. No drainage nearby, and the humidifier just draws in more damp. Yeah,
that's interesting. When you can see what sounds like almost liquid, i.e. the color of the mortar is changing in those joints, and you can tell, well, it's coming from somewhere, and it may be lower ground floor. So there's probably some sort of migration of liquid water from either damaged or broken surfaces, which is quite common lower down in buildings. It's also quite likely that you've got defective rainwater goods outside that are coming off the roof, down your downpipes, into the ground, and then maybe not going quite where it should go after that. So it might be worth, the fact that it's in the center is a sort of perhaps an accident of capillary roots and sort of ground makeup. But I'd be starting off looking at your peripheral drainage on the outside and looking in. I do appreciate when you're running dehumidifiers, if you're not sorting out the source of the origin of the water or the water vapor, it'll just keep coming. So I can understand that comment. So for me, this is probably a drainage one, or possibly services. Start on the outside of the building and work your way in. Some form of metal detector or pipe detector thing might help if there's some form of metallic thing going on, maybe a cast iron drain. Obviously, it won't pick up a clay or fired clay drain. So maybe a bit more investigation there, but clearly you have liquid water in the middle of the house, which probably isn't good.
Great. Another question has just come in. Lucy on Facebook. How do you balance the requirement for movement of air in chimney flues for vapor management with the need to prevent drafts?
Yeah, good question. I think partial blocking off is the answer. Perhaps a chimney balloon or a board with a vent that you can remove or put back. Some people have actually a sort of sliding panel that goes in at the top, at the sill of just under the mantle, so to speak, and then you just close it off completely, or have a trickle moving through it. So I think the answer is a little bit of a balance. In the Holyrood Park Lodge, where we had a chimney that was closed off, we had quite a generous hit and miss vent. You probably know those vertical grills. The small one, the standard size one, which is sort of 6 inches by 3, is a bit puny, doesn't really do the job. But the bigger ones, the full size ones, sort of 300 by 400 type size, are probably about the scale you need. So I'd perhaps be using that. And then in the summer, you can open it up, or if it's a board, take the board away. And in the winter, you perhaps close it off a bit more.
Similarly, if you do have a chimney piece there, but the flue is open, you can use what is called a damper to actually, you do the same, you close it off or keep it open. It's we need to link properly the Holyrood Park Lodge case study there, because it has both of these examples for you to look at.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I meant to mention. Yeah, thanks, Leela. Later hearths, particularly with cast iron insets, had dampers built in, so you could quite literally open and close it and shut it as you needed. Sometimes the hood, you pull the hood out to open the hearth and then push it back. Okay. Is that another one there?
Yes. Al on Facebook. Does wood fiber insulation in sloping roof require a modern vapor check layer before plastering?
Before plastering. Good question. That's good. if you want to go for PAS 2035 and the sort of sequential accreditation for that process, you do need a vapor AVCL active vapor control there, just because they want you to do it, just in case you have gaps and things. But to some extent, you're plastering, so that is I would argue that is your vapor, your air tightness layer as such. So I think technically the answer is no. Procedurally, if you're wanting to comply with PAS 2035, you probably do. If it was me, I would be I'd be plastering on that, probably with a lime because it's more flexible. I think a gypsum would probably crack. It's quite a brittle material, or indeed a clay, but that's perhaps up to you.
Great. Another question from Gordon on Facebook. Would you be able to post a list of approved conservation surveyors which you have referred to before? So we don't have a list, but what we do refer to is a link to the RICS website. That's the Royal Incorporation of Chartered Surveyors. And they actually have a dedicated search engine where we can search specifically for conservation accredited surveyors. So we will be able to link that very shortly. And also about architects, there is another search engine through the RAS website for architects. So we can definitely add these. Sorry, because we had a few comments coming up. Then finally, I think if we want to very quickly run through, because we have touched a little bit on insulation of buildings, we do have the energy retrofit guide that we always point people to because it's the newest publication we have. It's more updated and it covers a lot of the questions that you've been asking us. Of course, every situation is slightly different. And we often have a question about older buildings that have been modernized, usually in the 90s, have modern plasterboard throughout, and they want to insulate and they don't know how to insulate these buildings. So we have some images just to show you. We have talked about them in previous lives, but I thought it's worth looking at them now. So if we can show the image that we have of a mass masonry wall where there is maybe a lath and plaster. And if you do have modern plasterboard, you do have a couple of options there. Sorry, we have some images here. If we can show them.
So the sequence generally goes, from our perspective, with lath and plaster walls, blown insulation, blown cellulose works quite well. Gives you a U value of about 0.7, so a reasonable improvement and good enough for a building warrant. But not everyone has that situation, nor for whatever reason may not be able to do that, or it's not even in there. So some other images give you just a flavor of the variety that one could look at. So where you've got no traditional historic lining, just got a load of masonry. This is a project we did in South Uist, wood fiber board between vertical timber studs, pretty standard. It was a local joiner who did it. They made a really nice job. There's a sort of central support there that you probably won't always need, but that's there because there was a sort of partition in the room before. But I hope you get, so that's framing out with wood fiber. You can also press wood fiber directly onto the wall. Here's a slightly older system of wet cellulose sprayed on between vertical timber battens. Great for the whole air tightness piece because there's absolutely no gaps here. And then you sort of shave that back down to give you a flat face that then plasterboard goes on the top. And then our other image is an insulated lime plaster that goes on the hard, which is suitable in a more vernacular context or a small cottage context. And you can see here, that's the first layer of two sort of 30 mil layers of insulated lime plaster with a lime wash on top, and that's worked really nicely, and that might suit some buildings. Notice also the flagstone floor, which was taken up, insulated with lime concrete underneath, even got an underfloor heating loop which has worked very well, and then those flags put back down again. So I hope that's of interest. It's insulated lime plaster is not for everybody, but in some particularly cottage type scenarios, it's pretty good.
And we actually had a question about insulating and doing sort of retrofit changes to a house. So they are insulating under timber floor in an 1890s house. The external walls are lined out with a 35-40 millimeter air gap. How to deal with the junction between floor and wall, and they do not want to disturb the lath and plaster linings.
Right, this happens quite a lot. And it's that junction between the floor and the masonry, and it depends. Quite often the floorboards are sometimes touching the masonry, sometimes not. And in our case studies, we used a bit of hemp wool just to pack that sort of gap between the edge of the floorboard and the inside of the masonry. Remembering, of course, that the inside of the masonry should not be damp or wet, and if it is, you need to get outside and fix something outside. So all these floor measures, all these wall insulation measures, these are when you are the proud owner of a happy dry wall. And if you've got water on the inside face, go away and sort that out before looking at the internal linings. Certainly don't cover it up. So to answer Bill's message specifically, if you take the skirtings off, you will see the runner that the plaster stops at. You will also see the masonry of the wall in the sort of 200 mil of where the skirting board was, and you'll also see the gap between the edge of the floorboard and the inside of the inside of the masonry, and that's where we put the hemp fiber just as a way of closing that gap up a little.
Great. And actually, similar to that, another question from Claire on Facebook: is there an air gap between the fiberboard that we showed earlier and the wall?
In that particular example, there was. Most wood fiber systems now, and there are many out there now. So this was done about 8 years ago, to be honest. It's quite an old image. So now there's a variety of suppliers who will supply wood fiber, and generally you do a parge coat, which smooths the wall as flat as you can get it, or as smooth as you can get it, and then the plasterboard, the wood fiber board, is applied directly onto that. There's many advantages with that in that you don't need the vertical timber studding. If you do the vertical timber studding and you don't need the parge coat, there is quite often a active vapor control layer sheet on the back of the wood fiber and the front of the masonry, so to speak, which seems to be the industry convention that's emerging. So what we're seeing now is industry is responding to the demand for appropriate insulation techniques on older buildings, particularly pre-1919 ones. And there's a range of commercially available systems now that you can get. I'm trying to think of the manufacturers, but Stico is one. I'm not allowed to. Other manufacturers are available. There's quite a large insulation supplier in Stirling. You may want to Google them, and they're pretty up on different types of product for that.
So Claire, actually,
question. Yeah, okay. So the parge coat basically is almost plaster on the hard. You take a plastering trowel or a float and you smooth out the wall, plastering directly on the masonry, and then on that nice flattish surface you apply the wood fiber boards with a kind of limey glue. But
it's quite thinner. It's not like you wouldn't go to the depth.
Yeah, it's not an insulation layer in itself. It's just to get the wall flat.
Great.
And the reason you do that is to have that capillary and vapor continuity. So if there's any dampy spots, it is able to move capillary through the materials and disperse as vapor, which is what the wall did when it was built back in the day. That wall was soaking wet with wet mortar and everything. And it dried out because the building was able to dry out. So I hope that helps with parge coat.
No, that's great. We might give a few more minutes to see if we have any other questions, because we have already addressed all the ones that came through email. As we have mentioned before, some of them are quite detailed and lengthy, and whilst we can give some general advice and steer, we can't come out to the building, we can't see the details. So we do always advise that you get an experienced surveyor who can come to your house and actually look things in person.
And just to manage people's expectations, I've kind of moved to a different role within Hess. So I might get dragged back into the studio every now and then, but and the team are kind of limited on the capacity now for answering sort of questions generally. What we'll try and do is put you on the right track. So if there's a kind of snake oil salesperson, we can say, that might not be quite the route. You may want to follow this route as well. And once we get into detail, it gets quite hard. And also, we're starting to become your pet architect, which is probably not the idea. There's plenty of good architects out there and building surveyors who could very, very happily get their noses right up close to your building. And I'm hoping that we've routed you to some of our guidance that gets you steered in the right direction, so that when people come offering systems and rather complicated solutions, you can just sense check some of that with some of the background information that you've got from us.
Great. So I think maybe if we don't have any other questions coming in, we might have to conclude here, and to ask everyone for tuning in today. And if you've been watching this series, just thank you for supporting us. We hope you've been enjoying them and you found them informative. There will be a survey that's been posted in the chat after this session, so it would actually help us with planning of any future sessions. If there is a demand for different topics, more technical ones, etc., then we actually, HES produces a breadth of different kind of events, online events, also in person, and we're hoping that these will resume. So if you want to hear about any future topics, events, please sign to our newsletter and check the Engine Shed website. As I said, some of the activity that had been paused due to COVID will hopefully resume. And I'd like to thank everyone. Thank Roger especially, because he's been amazing in answering all of the questions that are coming through.
Good. And when we pick up in the autumn, well, it may be me, may not be me, but we'll have a competition as the weirdest place from which we can answer questions. That could be quite amusing. Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
Again. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.